The storm had arrived earlier than expected. By late afternoon, gray clouds rolled in like an army marching across the sky, and soon Haven Ridge was soaked in cold, relentless rain. Most residents of the sleepy town had retreated into their warm homes, lights flickering behind curtained windows, while the wind howled down narrow streets. But one person remained out. Margaret Ellsworth, known affectionately by her neighbors as Miss Maggie, was on her way home from the corner store, wrapped in her oversized tan coat and holding a worn green umbrella that battled against the gusts. She was 76 years old, with silver curls tucked neatly under her hood and wire-rimmed glasses that fogged up with every breath. Her gait was slow but purposeful, and though she grumbled about the weather, she took the same path home she always had, the long way past the old church, around the small rose garden, and up the hill toward her cottage. Havenridge had always been a quiet town, the kind that time seemed to forget. Streets were lined with tall trees that turned golden in the fall and flowered in spring. But in the rain it became somber. The flowers drooped, the birds went quiet, and puddles reflected a gray sky overhead. Still, Margaret didn't mind it. She found a strange kind of peace in rainstorms. It was during moments like these that she felt closest to the past, to her younger years, to her late husband Daniel, and to the rhythm of a life lived fully and honestly. As she passed the little park by the edge of the cemetery wall, she heard it, so faint she nearly missed it. A sound lost in the wind, like a squeaky hinge. But it came again, a tiny, trembling meow. Margaret paused. Her tired eyes scanned the wet grass and leaf-strewn sidewalk. At first she saw nothing but the blur of raindrops. Then by the iron gate of the cemetery, she noticed a shadow, small, soaked, and shivering. A kitten, black as night, with fur plastered to its skin and enormous green eyes that glowed even in the storm. The poor thing looked barely old enough to be on its own. Margaret's heart clenched. "Oh, sweet darling," she whispered, already stepping off the path and toward the gate. The kitten didn't run but pressed itself lower into the wet earth, trembling. It let out another cry, softer now, hoarse. She crouched slowly, her joints protesting, and held out a hand. "Come here, love. You're all right. Let's get you out of this dreadful weather." The kitten inched forward, cautiously, as if weighing its trust. Margaret waited patiently, whispering gentle encouragements. At last, with a tentative step and a quivering tail, the kitten reached her, rubbing its tiny head against her outstretched fingers. Margaret scooped the creature up, tucking it inside her coat. It was so light she barely felt the weight, but its warmth against her chest made her suddenly aware of just how cold she'd been. She made her way home quicker than usual, the kitten curled against her heart. Her cottage stood just past the woods, a modest white house with blue shutters and a chimney that puffed gently when the fireplace was lit. Inside it was filled with the scent of lavender and old books, the walls lined with framed photographs of her family and Afghans draped over every cozy surface. She laid the kitten down on a soft towel by the hearth, lit the fire, and went to the kitchen to warm some milk. As she worked, her thoughts kept drifting to the little creature. Where had it come from? It didn't wear a collar. Surely someone in town would have mentioned a missing kitten. But deep down, she already knew. This wasn't someone else's cat. This cat had come to her. After drying the kitten and coaxing it to drink from a saucer, Margaret prepared a small box with a blanket and placed it beside her chair. She watched it curl up, still trembling slightly, but with a growing sense of safety. The firelight danced across its sleek black fur, casting long shadows across the room. It wasn't just the storm outside that made Margaret feel something was different tonight. "This is your home now," she said softly, her voice barely more than a breath. "If you'll have me." She named the kitten Clara, after her mother, a name she hadn't spoken aloud in years. From that night onward, they were inseparable. In the days that followed, the rain gave way to crisp autumn sunshine. The leaves turned to fiery amber and gold, and Havenridge settled back into its usual rhythm. Margaret introduced Clara to the house, one room at a time. The kitten explored with wide eyes, sometimes skidding across polished floors, sometimes knocking down knitting baskets or chasing shadows on the wall. There was joy in the chaos. For Margaret, Clara became more than just a pet. She was companionship, a quiet soul who listened without needing words. In the evenings, Margaret would sit by the window with a book, and Clara would curl up in her lap, purring like a tiny engine. The purr was healing, she thought, a balm for old, a balm for old grief. Mornings became their ritual. Margaret would prepare a cup of tea and feed Clara by the kitchen window while the sun spilled in. Sometimes she would talk to her, not expecting replies but grateful for the presence. "Do you know, Clara," she said one morning as the kitten batted at falling leaves outside, "I haven't felt this alive in years. I suppose I was a bit lonely before you came." Clara responded with a meow and a leap onto the windowsill. As months passed, Clara grew. Her coat turned glossy and thick, and her green eyes became even more striking. Neighbors commented on her beauty and gentle demeanor. Children in the village adored her, but Clara never let anyone else hold her. She belonged to Margaret, and Margaret to her. Each night, Clara would sleep at the foot of the bed, occasionally padding up to nuzzle Margaret's hand in the dark. On particularly cold evenings, she'd crawl beneath the blankets and curl against her belly. In those moments, Margaret felt young again. There was a quiet magic between them, the kind of bond not forged through grand adventures, but through shared silence, mutual respect, and the tender passing of days. One December evening, when snow blanketed the streets and the fireplace glowed with a steady flame, Margaret sat writing in her journal. Clara lay beside her, her head resting on Margaret's thigh. "If anything should ever happen to me," she wrote, "I hope someone will tell Clara where I've gone. I don't want her to wonder. I don't want her to be alone." It was a morbid thought, perhaps, but when you've lived long enough, you begin to think about such things, not out of fear, but out of preparation. Margaret had always believed in planning ahead. She'd buried a husband, raised a child, survived 2 strokes, and planted daisies every spring. She was a woman who understood the value of tying loose ends. She looked down at Clara, now asleep, her ears twitching with some dream. "I'll stay as long as I can, love," she whispered, "and when I go, know that I'll still be with you, in every rustling leaf and morning sunbeam." She didn't expect the end to come so soon. It happened quietly, on a spring morning. Margaret didn't wake up. There were no signs of struggle, no pain, just a stillness that settled in like the last note of a lullaby. Clara was the first to notice. She pawed gently at Margaret's arm, then lay beside her, waiting. Hours passed. A neighbor eventually came to check, alerted by the fact that Margaret hadn't come out to collect her mail. The funeral was held in the village cemetery, the same place where Clara had been found. A small gathering filled with tears and shared stories. People spoke of Margaret's warmth, her wisdom, her laughter, of how she always had time for others, of how she'd given even a lonely little kitten a second chance. Clara didn't attend, of course. She remained in the empty house, silent, watching the door, waiting. The neighbors tried to find her a new home, but Clara wouldn't stay. She slipped away, disappearing into the night. Many assumed she had run off into the woods or found another family. But a week later, someone walking past the cemetery in the early hours of Sunday morning saw something unusual. A black cat, sitting atop a fresh grave, curled up, sleeping. Clara returned to the grave every Sunday. No one had shown her the way. No one had guided her. Yet just as the church bells rang softly in the background each week and the morning sun filtered through the tall oaks surrounding Havenridge Cemetery, there she was, curled atop the modest gray headstone of Margaret Ellsworth, her velvety black coat shimmering in the early light. At first, people assumed it was coincidence, a cat's random wanderings, perhaps drawn by the warmth of sunlit stone or the comfort of routine. But as weeks turned into months and seasons quietly shifted around them, it became clear this was no accident. Clara was mourning. The groundskeeper, old Mr. Franks, was the first to truly take notice. Each Sunday, while trimming hedges or clearing debris, he'd glance toward Margaret's resting place and find the small black figure sitting still, so still it looked carved from onyx. Sometimes Clara lay curled in a tight ball. Other times she sat upright, alert, her green eyes scanning the distance. Always quiet, always there. He began to leave out a small dish of water nearby, and once placed an old cushion beneath the headstone when the frost rolled in. "She's grieving," he told his wife one night over dinner. "I've seen grief, even in animals, and that cat, she's got the saddest eyes I've ever seen." Others started noticing too. Families visiting their own lost loved ones would pause, watching the lone cat in her solemn vigil. Children would whisper to their parents, asking why she was there. Some would try to approach her, offering treats or calling softly. But Clara would always retreat silently if anyone got too close. She wasn't afraid, just private. Whatever bond she held with Margaret was not something to be shared. Back at Margaret's house, things had changed. The cottage, once filled with the smells of lavender and baked bread, now sat silent. Dust settled in corners. The flowers in the garden, once lovingly pruned by Margaret's steady hands, wilted under the weight of neglect. Sarah, Margaret's only daughter, had returned after the funeral to handle the estate. A neat, practical woman in her early 50s, Sarah had always lived a life that was fast-paced, structured, and guided by schedules and spreadsheets. She hadn't understood her mother's attachment to the house or the cat. Clara had been gone when she arrived, and honestly, Sarah hadn't put in much effort to find her. "A cat's a cat," she had muttered, rifling through her mother's papers, deciding what to keep and what to toss. She hadn't known the depth of the relationship between Clara and Margaret. She hadn't seen the way Clara curled into Margaret's lap every evening, or the way the old woman spoke to her in hushed tones, like confessing secrets to a trusted friend. For Sarah, grief took the shape of practicality. She contacted an estate agent, set up the necessary documentation, and scheduled an appraisal for the property. But every time she walked through the house, a strange emptiness clung to the walls. There were no voices, no laughter, no Clara. Just a lingering absence that made the air feel heavy. One day, while sorting through Margaret's old journals and recipe books, Sarah came across a small, worn envelope. It had her name on it, scrawled in her mother's looping script. Inside was a letter. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, it means I've gone ahead to be with your father. Please don't be too sad. I've had a beautiful life, and a peaceful end is all I ever wanted. I know you've got 1,000 things to do, and I imagine you're handling them just fine. You were always the capable one. But I want to ask a favor of you. If Clara is still around, please be kind to her. She's more than just a cat. She's been my shadow, my comfort, my friend. I truly believe she came into my life for a reason. Animals like her, they know things she might not take to anyone else. That's just how she is. But know this, if she's gone to the cemetery, she's looking for me. And if you ever find her there, let her be. She's keeping her promise." Sarah had stared at the letter for a long time. It felt like her mother's voice was in the room again. Warm, firm, full of quiet strength. The kind of voice that could both soothe and stir. She hadn't understood it then. But the next weekend, driven by a restless curiosity, Sarah found herself walking toward the cemetery, scarf tight around her neck, breath misting in the morning air. She didn't have to look far. There, just as the townspeople had said, was Clara, sitting silently atop her mother's grave, the early sun brushing her fur with a golden glow. She didn't flinch when Sarah approached. She didn't move. She just turned her head slightly, offering a single deep gaze with those green eyes, full of something ancient and knowing. Sarah felt something inside her tremble. This wasn't just a cat. This was a memory keeper, a guardian.
In the weeks that followed, Sarah began to return every Sunday. At first, it was to see Clara. But as the visits grew more regular, she found herself staying longer, cleaning the old headstone, trimming the grass, placing flowers like her mother used to. And Clara would always be there, arriving from the woods like clockwork, walking with silent grace, her presence both comforting and haunting. Something shifted in Sarah during those visits. She began to slow down, to breathe differently. She started bringing her mother's journals with her, reading them by the grave. She laughed at old stories. Cried at memories she tried to forget. Sometimes, she talked out loud, half to herself, half to the cat. And Clara listened. Back in town, the tale of the black cat became folklore. Children would peer through the cemetery gates on Sundays, whispering to one another. "That's the ghost cat," they'd say. "She waits for the old lady." Poets began leaving scribbled verses beside the grave. Artists painted her likeness into murals. One elderly man who'd lost his wife began bringing Clara bits of chicken every week, convinced she brought peace. Clara never missed a Sunday. Rain, snow, or blistering sun, she came. And though she never let anyone touch her, they all felt they knew her. She became something sacred. A living legend in a world that had forgotten how to believe in magic. One day, Sarah brought a small notebook to the grave. It had once belonged to her mother, but the pages were blank. That morning, after placing fresh lilacs by the headstone, she sat on the bench nearby and opened it. Clara sat, as always, in quiet vigil. "I think I understand now," Sarah said softly. "Why she loved you. Why you stayed. You're home." Then she began to write. Not just about her mother. But about life. About love. About grief and healing. About the way time could break a person, and still give them pieces to rebuild. Clara blinked slowly, as if approving. The graveyard became a place of solace, not just for Sarah, but for the entire town. A place where people brought not just their sadness, but their hope. And always, at its heart, was the cat. The one who slept on the grave. The one who remembered. As spring unfurled its green fingers across Havenridge, the town bloomed to life in a way only small towns nestled in valleys could. The dogwoods along the cemetery fence blossomed, their petals soft and white like folded handkerchiefs. Daffodils pushed through the thawing ground, and the breeze began to carry the scent of earth and warmth instead of winter's tired sighs. Clara remained a fixture at Margaret's grave. Sunday after Sunday, she came, undaunted by the cold, the rain, or even the rowdy children who sometimes passed by on their bicycles. She was steady, silent, and deeply devoted. But with the changing of seasons, something else began to shift. It wasn't just the flowers that returned, it was the town's pulse. People noticed Clara more. They began to not just talk about her but to connect with her story. What once had been idle whispers now became heartfelt conversations. "She's been coming here for over a year," Mr. Franks told the local librarian one morning as they drank coffee under the awning of the church. "She's mourning," replied the librarian, a woman who wore long scarves and quoted poetry. "Cats never forget. That's what makes it both beautiful and painful." It was true, Clara had become part of Havenridge lore. Visitors from other towns would sometimes stop by just to see the grave cat. A few even wrote about her in blogs and newsletters. Photos of her curled atop Margaret's headstone made their way into social media feeds and local newspapers. And still, Clara didn't seem to notice. Her world, as always, was private. Sarah, on the other hand, was noticing everything. What had started as a sense of duty, a need to honor her mother's request, had quietly become something more profound. Sarah found herself planning her weeks around her Sunday visits. She even brought books and sometimes a thermos of tea. There was something meditative about the cemetery, and something incredibly grounding about Clara. The first time Clara approached her was on a damp spring morning. Sarah had arrived early, long before the bells rang and the mist had fully lifted from the grass. She was standing quietly by the grave, reading one of her mother's journals, when she felt something brush against her ankle. Startled, she looked down, and there was Clara, gently winding her body around Sarah's legs. It wasn't fear. It wasn't demand. It was an acknowledgement. Thank you, perhaps. Sarah knelt, holding her breath as she reached out a hand. Clara hesitated, then slowly pressed her head into Sarah's palm. Her fur was soft. Warm. Real. That was the moment Sarah felt it, the weight of everything she had misunderstood. Her mother hadn't been a lonely old woman with a cat. She had been in love. In love with life, with nature, with the quiet rhythms of home. Clara had been a witness to that life. A keeper of its gentlest moments. Over the summer, Sarah began to restore the house. It was an impulsive decision at first. She hadn't planned to keep it, not really. But one afternoon, while watering the overgrown hydrangeas in the backyard, she felt a tug in her chest. A whisper, almost, "Don't let it go." And so, with the help of a few neighbors and the steady guidance of Mr. Henderson, the retired carpenter, she began. The porch was repaired. The garden was replanted. Inside, she cleared away dust and uncovered memories hidden in old drawers, framed photos, and forgotten recipes tucked inside cookbooks. She brought Clara to the house once in July. The cat had followed her all the way from the cemetery that morning, walking beside her with the calm confidence of someone who had walked that path 1,000 times. As they stepped onto the porch, Clara paused. Then, as if remembering, stepped inside. She moved with familiarity. Hopped onto the old armchair. Curled up without hesitation. For Sarah, it was like watching someone return to their childhood home. She stood in the doorway for a long time, hand on her heart, as Clara slept in the place where Margaret had once spent her afternoons knitting and sipping chamomile tea. That day, Sarah unpacked an old record player and played her mother's favorite classical piece. The notes drifted through the house like memories made manifest. Autumn arrived with a blaze of color. The trees along the streets of Havenridge erupted into gold, amber, and fire-red hues. The air turned crisp, and children returned to school in scarves and boots. Clara's visits to the cemetery continued unchanged. Even the fall rains didn't deter her. But it was during this season that something deeper began to form between her and Sarah. Now, Clara didn't just tolerate Sarah, she greeted her. She'd brush against her legs. Sit beside her on the bench. Follow her to the edge of the property before retreating again to Margaret's resting place. The villagers started to notice this as well. "Looks like she's adopted you too," Mr. Frank said with a knowing smile. Sarah would only nod, a lump forming in her throat. Because yes, she was being adopted, but not by a cat. By a memory. By a story that was rewriting her life in small, quiet ways. Winter came early that year. The first snow dusted the hills in late November, and Havenridge took on a soft, sleepy stillness. Roads were quiet. Smoke curled from chimneys. The cemetery, now blanketed in white, looked like something from a postcard. And Clara still came. Sarah worried, of course. She built a small insulated shelter near the grave, a weather-resistant wooden box with blankets inside and a flap to keep out the snow. She left food and water discreetly nearby. And though Clara rarely used the box while Sarah was watching, the disturbed snow suggested she found comfort there when alone. One particularly cold Sunday, Sarah didn't come. A sudden snowstorm had closed the roads and blanketed the town. When she returned the following week, guilt weighed heavy on her chest. But Clara was there. Sitting calmly on the headstone, as she always had, watching the horizon as if nothing had changed. Sarah knelt beside her and wept, not just for the missed visit, but for the magnitude of the cat's devotion. She whispered apologies. She stroked Clara's back. And in that quiet graveyard under a pale winter sky, something inside her settled. She understood now. She truly understood. It was no longer about grief. It was about love. The kind that endures storms, seasons, even death. Clara was more than a cat, she was a symbol. A promise kept. A love that stretched across time. Sarah took out her mother's last journal that day and added a final entry. Clara came again today. Just like always. And so did I. Maybe love never leaves. It just changes shape. Sometimes into memory. Sometimes into a cat who waits. And sometimes, into a daughter who finally understands. The winter passed slowly, blanketing Havenridge in a long hush that muffled footsteps and softened even the hardest edges of grief. And then, like all winters do, it broke. The snow melted, the soil warmed, and the songbirds returned, shaking the silence from the trees. With spring's return came Clara's transformation. Where once she was quiet and distant, a shadow of memory haunting the cemetery grounds, she now became a familiar presence at Sarah's doorstep. Every Sunday, instead of returning immediately to her own home in the city, Sarah lingered in Havenridge longer. She often stayed until Tuesday now, working remotely from her mother's old reading room, converted into a small home office. Clara, once so attached to the cemetery, had begun to split her time between Margaret's grave and the home they had shared. One Sunday morning, Sarah brewed her tea and stepped outside to find Clara already waiting on the porch, her tail curled neatly around her paws. "You're early today," Sarah whispered, smiling softly. "Come on, let's go see her." Together they walked the winding path from the house to the cemetery, a path Clara clearly knew by heart. As they passed blooming dogwoods and daffodils, Sarah couldn't help but marvel at the sense of peace that had begun to bloom inside her. It had started slowly, first as guilt, then sorrow, and now something gentler. A kind of healing. Margaret's grave was framed now by wild violets and tall grass, the kind of overgrown beauty that can't be manufactured. It was natural, soft, exactly how Margaret would have liked it. Clara stepped ahead and took her usual place, curling atop the headstone as if she belonged to the earth itself. Sarah sat on the bench nearby, her thoughts drifting. That was when she noticed it, the garden gate. Beyond the cemetery wall, through a thin veil of trees, stood the remnants of Margaret's old garden. Sarah had passed it 100 times, but never truly seen it. There was a rusted iron gate, nearly hidden by ivy, and just beyond, a path overrun with weeds and thyme. Drawn by something she couldn't name, Sarah stood and followed the path. Clara remained behind, her eyes watching. The gate creaked open with resistance. Sarah stepped into what had once been a sanctuary, her mother's secret garden. It was far larger than she'd remembered. Stone borders outlined the skeletons of flower beds, and an old wooden arbor stood like a sentinel, its latticework entwined with the ghost of last year's honeysuckle. As she wandered deeper, she found something unexpected, a small bench, half buried in leaves, and beside it, a stone pedestal holding a weathered notebook. Her breath caught in her throat. She reached down and opened the notebook, its pages yellowed but intact. It was Margaret's handwriting. The first page read, "For Clara, should she ever be found." Sarah sat slowly, the weight of the moment sinking in. She turned the pages, her eyes scanning words written in the soft looping script of her mother. "I never meant to keep secrets. But some stories write themselves only when the heart is too full to speak them aloud. Clara came to me not as a kitten, but as a whisper in the wind. She belonged to no one and yet she found me. After Thomas died, I didn't speak for weeks. The world was a hollow thing. But Clara, she sat with me. She didn't ask me to be okay. She didn't fill the silence. She just stayed. She would curl beside me in the garden as I planted. She watched me as I wept. She was never just a pet. She was a soul I'd known before, maybe in another life. And in her eyes, I saw a companion, one who didn't need words to understand. When the doctor told me the truth, I knew I didn't have long. I made plans for the house, for my books, for my journals. But for Clara, I made no plans. Because how can you plan for a spirit that chooses to stay or go on her own terms? I believe she will return here, after I'm gone. I believe she will wait for me, as I will wait for her, wherever I go next. And perhaps, someday, someone will find this place and understand, love never ends. It changes, it lingers, it becomes something softer. Tears traced silent paths down Sarah's cheeks. Her mother had known. She had known Clara's heart before anyone else. She had trusted that Clara's love would endure, and had left behind this hidden truth like a pressed flower in the pages of time. Sarah sat there for a long while, the sunlight slanting across the garden. She thought of her mother planting bulbs in the spring, laughing as Clara chased butterflies. She imagined the conversations they must have shared, unspoken, yet so deeply felt. Clara never appeared while Sarah was in the garden that day. As if she knew it was a sacred space, meant for memory and quiet. But when Sarah returned to the grave, Clara was waiting. This time, when Sarah sat beside her, Clara climbed into her lap. It was the first time. And it wasn't just affection, it was permission. A passing of something unspoken. A promise honored. The next few weeks were a blur of rediscovery. Sarah returned to the garden again and again, each visit peeling back more layers of her mother's hidden world. There were other notebooks tucked in waterproof tins beneath stones. Recipes, reflections, even poems. Margaret had never truly been alone. She had lived a rich, vibrant life with Clara at her side, with nature as her cathedral. Sarah brought life back to the garden. She pruned, she planted. She turned the hidden sanctuary into a place of memory and meditation. A bench with a new cushion. A stone engraved with her mother's favorite quote, "Love is not gone. It's simply waiting for us to notice it again." Clara came often now. Not just on Sundays. She would lie in the flower beds or watch the bees from beneath the arbor. Sometimes she'd rest on the bench beside Sarah, their silence filled with a profound companionship. The townspeople began visiting the garden too. Mrs. Gable brought tea. The local school children planted sunflowers. Mr. Henderson helped build a trellis. The garden became a haven not just for Sarah and Clara, but for the entire village. And in the center, always, was the story of Margaret and Clara, a tale that reminded everyone that love does not vanish. It transforms. One day, a little girl named Lucy stood beside Sarah in the garden. She was no more than 7, her pigtails bouncing as she pointed at Clara. "Is she yours?" she asked. Sarah smiled, her eyes never leaving Clara. "No," she said softly. "She belongs to someone who loved her first. I'm just lucky she lets me love her now too." Spring ripened into summer again. And though the seasons changed and the flowers came and went, one thing remained constant. Clara. Always at the grave on Sundays. Always beside the garden during the week. Watching. Remembering. Teaching. And Sarah, no longer just a daughter of loss, but a woman reclaimed by memory and peace, understood her role in the story now. She was the keeper. Of the garden. Of Margaret's legacy. Of Clara's unwavering devotion. The attic of Margaret's cottage had long been a place of mystery, an untouched trove of forgotten seasons and silent stories. Sarah had never ventured up there during her childhood. It had always been off-limits, a place her mother rarely spoke about. But now, months after her return to Havenridge and her reconnection with Clara, she found herself drawn to it with a quiet pull that refused to loosen. It was a warm Saturday morning in late summer. The garden was in full bloom, humming with bees and drenched in the scent of lavender and rose. Clara was asleep on the porch swing, her chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm, her whiskers twitching with dreams. Sarah stood at the bottom of the narrow attic staircase, a flashlight in one hand and a scarf tied around her hair. Dust floated in the shafts of light filtering down through the hallway window, dancing like whispers from the past. She took a deep breath, then climbed. Each creaking step seemed to echo into the quiet. When she reached the top, the old wooden door gave a slight protest before opening. The scent of aged wood, paper, and time enveloped her like a cloak. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, some labeled in her mother's handwriting, Summer 1973, Sarah's baby clothes, Thomas's tools, and others simply marked miscellaneous. It was the kind of space that carried echoes. A place where memories weren't just stored, they were preserved. Sarah moved slowly, gently brushing off cobwebs and wiping dust from lids. She wasn't looking for anything specific, and yet she knew something would find her. It did. In the far corner beneath an old quilted blanket, she discovered a cedar trunk. It was locked, but the key lay atop it, tied with a ribbon that had long faded from red to pink. Inside, among bundles of old letters, pressed flowers, and a faded photograph of Margaret and Thomas on their wedding day, was a single envelope resting atop a journal. It was addressed in careful handwriting. To Sarah, when the time is right. Her heart paused. She opened it with reverence, unfolding the letter with trembling fingers. My dearest Sarah. If you're reading this, it means you've come home. Not just to this house, but to something deeper. I imagine Clara was part of the reason why. She always had a way of drawing people back to what matters. There are so many things I wish I'd told you, but time, it can be stubborn. I know I wasn't always easy to understand. I held my emotions close, and after your father died, I sank into a kind of quiet I didn't know how to leave. But I want you to know this, I loved you more than anything. You were my greatest joy, even when I didn't say it enough. Clara came to me during the darkest part of my life. She wasn't just a stray or a cat. She was a soul that healed parts of me no one else could reach. In her, I found something ancient, something comforting, like a presence that had known me long before I was born. I believe animals carry wisdom we've forgotten. They see truths we refuse to face. Clara saw mine. She stayed with me, listened without judgment, and reminded me of beauty every single day. And now, if she's still with you, I believe she's there for a reason. Maybe she knows you need her, too. Maybe she's helping you the way she helped me, gently, silently, without asking anything in return. If you found the garden, then you've already seen where I kept my most honest self. And if you're still in this house, I hope you've come to feel the love woven into every beam, every creak of the floor. Let this be your home again, if you want it. Or let it be a place you visit when you need to remember who you are. And know that wherever I am now, I am proud of you. Always, Mom. P.S. Give Clara a kiss from me. Sarah folded the letter against her chest, eyes closed, tears sliding down her cheeks. She sat there for a long while in silence, letting the presence of the room wrap around her. The words of the letter echoed through her soul like music heard once and never forgotten. When she finally stood, she carried more than just paper with her, she carried the weight of understanding. Later that evening, she found Clara watching her from the hallway, her tail flicking gently. I found it, Sarah whispered, kneeling to meet her gaze. She wrote to me. About you. About everything. Clara stepped forward, touching her forehead gently against Sarah's. It was the first time she'd ever done that. The touch was light but electric, a connection forged not just by presence, but by shared memory. I think you knew I needed her words, Sarah said, stroking the cat's soft fur. You brought me back, didn't you? Clara purred quietly, then walked ahead, leading Sarah back out to the garden as the sun dipped below the horizon. There, surrounded by flowers and soft wind chimes, Sarah lit a candle and placed it on the stone bench beside her mother's quote. She read the letter again, aloud this time, her voice clear and strong. The candlelight flickered like a heartbeat in the dark. In the following weeks, Sarah began making changes, not just to the house, but to her life. She worked fewer hours. She started writing again, something she hadn't done in years. She documented her experiences in Havenridge, the garden, Clara, and her mother's legacy. She began sharing the story with others, online at first, then in the local paper. People were captivated not just by the reunion with Clara, but by the idea that some bonds are so deep, they echo through time and loss. Soon, letters began arriving. From people who had lost pets, from daughters who had never reconciled with their mothers, from lonely souls who just wanted to believe in love that doesn't end. Sarah wrote them all back. She didn't have answers, not really. But she had Clara, the garden, the grave, and her mother's voice. And sometimes, that was more than enough. One morning, just before fall settled in, Sarah woke to find Clara waiting beside her bed, not at her usual place on the porch or at the grave, but there, with intent in her amber eyes. She meowed once, then walked toward the door. Sarah followed. They walked through the house, through the garden, past the cemetery, and down a path Sarah had never noticed. It twisted past the edge of the woods, through a small grove where golden leaves drifted gently to the forest floor. At the end of the path, Clara stopped before a smooth, flat stone partially hidden beneath moss and ivy. Sarah knelt, brushing the green aside. There was no inscription. Just a small carving of a paw print and the faint outline of a heart. Tears welled in her eyes. Is this where she found you?" she whispered. Clara didn't answer, but she settled herself at the base of the stone, curling her tail neatly around her body. Her eyes closed. Sarah sat beside her and watched the light filter through the trees. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt whole, not because everything was perfect or complete, but because something ancient and sacred had been restored. The golden light of autumn wrapped Haven Ridge in a warm, nostalgic haze. Leaves turned into embers, amber, crimson, and gold, fluttering from the trees like old memories finding their way home. The scent of wood smoke mingled with crisp apples and the earthy fragrance of the turning season. For Sarah, every day now felt like a quiet miracle. Since discovering the letter in the attic and the unmarked stone deep in the grove, something within her had shifted. It was as though the cottage had finally accepted her presence, not as a visitor or a grieving daughter, but as its rightful soul. The silence inside the house no longer felt heavy, it felt peaceful. Clara continued her weekly pilgrimage to Margaret's grave every Sunday. Rain or shine, warm or cold, she would rise early, gently nudge Sarah awake, and lead the way to the grave nestled between wild rose bushes and lavender. There, she would curl beside the headstone and remain still for hours, her eyes sometimes closed, sometimes watching the wind dance in the grass. Sarah had stopped questioning it. The cat's ritual was not hers to interrupt or interpret, it simply was. On one such Sunday morning, Sarah joined her as usual. She brought a small bouquet of chrysanthemums, Margaret's favorite, and placed them beside the granite marker. Clara blinked slowly in approval and stretched out, her sleek black coat gleaming in the morning light. Sarah sat beside her on the bench, a thermos of tea in hand, a book she couldn't quite focus on resting in her lap. Today felt different. The air carried a stillness, a weight. The birds were quieter. Even the wind seemed more subdued, as though the world had briefly paused to listen. Sarah glanced at Clara. The cat's eyes were half closed, her body warm against the chill, but there was something, resolved about her posture. As if this visit carried a deeper purpose. "Do you miss her too?" Sarah asked softly. Clara's tail twitched once, then stilled. "She loved you," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think in some ways, you were her greatest comfort." There was a silence then, an understanding that needed no words. Sarah leaned back, eyes tracing the sky as clouds drifted like parchment. "You know," she said, more to herself than the cat, "I've been thinking about staying. Permanently." The decision had been dancing at the edge of her thoughts for weeks, but today, it stepped forward, bold and unshakable. Life in the city, the constant noise, the endless rushing, it didn't fit her anymore. It felt like a borrowed coat she'd finally grown out of. But Haven Ridge? The garden, the porch swing, Clara's quiet companionship? That felt like home. Clara turned to look at her. Their eyes met. A silent agreement passed between them. The next few days were a flurry of gentle purpose. Sarah began packing her apartment in the city, visiting the landlord, closing accounts, and saying her goodbyes. She didn't feel sadness, just clarity. The chapter was closing naturally, as all stories do when the final sentence has been written. Back in Havenridge, she dedicated herself to finishing the garden before the first frost. The villagers noticed. Mrs. Gable dropped off fresh baked scones one morning and stood watching Sarah work. "You've got your mother's touch," she said, eyes misty. Sarah smiled. "I think it's the soil. It remembers her." Mr. Henderson came by later that week to help reinforce the garden fence, and young Sarah, the bright teenager from down the lane, offered to help gather the last of the wildflowers. The final blooms of autumn, golden sunflowers, fiery marigolds, and rust-hued cosmos, stood tall despite the fading season. Sarah picked a bundle every morning, placing them by the grave, and sometimes leaving one in Clara's favorite windowsill. Clara, though older now and moving a little slower, continued to shadow Sarah faithfully. They shared tea in the mornings. Clara followed her through rooms being repainted, perched on shelves as Sarah rearranged books, and curled at her feet in the evenings when she sat by the fire with a journal in hand. In those pages, Sarah began writing their story, her mother's, hers, and Clara's. A tale of loss, reunion, and the kind of love that lingers long after a heart stops beating. Then, one night, it rained. A soft, persistent rain that tapped gently on the windowpanes and lulled the town into sleep. Sarah sat by the fireplace, Clara nestled against her side, her fur warm and damp from her evening walk. Sarah stroked her absently, lost in thought. "I think she's still here," she murmured. "In this house. In you. In the garden." Clara blinked slowly, her eyes reflecting the firelight like twin lanterns. "I wonder," Sarah whispered, her voice catching in her throat, "how long you'll stay." The next morning, Clara didn't wake Sarah. The room felt unusually still. The rain had passed, but the sky remained a pale gray, as if the sun was hesitant to rise. Sarah stirred, noticing the absence immediately. She found Clara in the garden, beneath the old oak tree where wildflowers grew thick and tangled. She was curled into herself, her breathing shallow, her body still. Sarah knelt, panic tightening her chest. "Clara," she whispered. The cat opened her eyes slowly and met her gaze. There was no fear, only calm. She gave a soft, breathy purr, barely audible, and blinked once. Sarah gathered her into her arms. Clara didn't resist. Her body was featherlight, warm, and familiar. "I'm here," Sarah said, rocking gently. "I'm right here." She carried her inside, wrapped her in the old quilt from the attic, and laid her beside the fireplace, the same place where Margaret once napped with her in the evenings. All that day, Clara rested, unmoving. Sarah stayed by her side, reading aloud from the journal, telling stories, humming lullabies her mother used to sing. That night, just before the fire went out, Clara stirred once. She looked at Sarah, stretched her paw toward her, and then, with the faintest exhale, slipped away. The days that followed were a blur. The village mourned with Sarah. Flowers appeared on the porch. Letters of sympathy were slipped into the mailbox. Someone left a framed photo of Clara at the cemetery gate, taken years ago as she curled beside Margaret's grave. Sarah buried her beneath the oak tree in the garden, marking the spot with a small stone and a ring of wildflowers. She carved a single word into the stone. Beloved. As autumn faded into winter, Sarah found herself alone, but not lost. The grief was deep, but not hollow. It was full of love, of memories, of the extraordinary life she'd shared with a black cat who had waited faithfully every Sunday beside a grave, keeping a promise long after her owner had gone. Clara's absence was felt everywhere, on the windowsill where she once sat, in the warmth of the bed at night, in the rustle of the leaves she used to chase. But she had left something behind too. A legacy. Of love. Of loyalty. Of healing. Sarah continued writing, her words reaching more readers with each passing month. People from faraway places sent her letters, poems, stories of their own pets, of their grief, and of the quiet magic that sometimes arrives on four paws. One spring morning, just as the crocuses began to bloom, Sarah woke to find a small orange kitten sitting at her garden gate. Alone. Shivering. And staring straight at her. She stepped forward cautiously, kneeling down. "Hey there," she whispered. The kitten blinked. Sarah smiled through tears she didn't expect. "You're not her," she said gently. "But maybe, just maybe, she sent you." The kitten took a tentative step forward and rubbed its head against her hand. And just like that, the story began again. Spring returned to Havenridge like an old friend stepping through the door after a long, cold silence. The snow melted from the hills, the brooks bubbled with laughter again, and every tree bud seemed to hum with a gentle promise, life goes on. In the heart of town, nestled between the winding paths and drowsy trees, Eleanor Preston's cottage awoke too. The shutters were thrown open. The windows gleamed in the sunlight. And in the backyard, where wildflowers had once bloomed and faded and bloomed again, something new stirred. Sarah, with dirt on her jeans and a trowel in her hand, knelt by the flowerbed that bordered Clara's resting place. The old black cat lay beneath the oak tree now, where the wind whispered softly through the leaves and the air always smelled like home. It had been several months since Clara's passing, months filled with aching silence and gentle healing. Sarah had poured her grief into the soil, planting bulbs and seeds with the care of someone who believed in rebirth. Now, the garden was coming back to life. Pale purple crocuses poked through the earth like shy smiles. Daffodils leaned toward the sun. And tulips, red and golden and bold, reached skyward in defiance of the frost that had once claimed them. Sarah paused her digging and wiped her forehead with the back of her glove. Beside her, nestled into an old wicker basket, the small orange kitten watched intently. It had no name yet, at least, not one that had settled. She'd tried a dozen: Sunny, Ember, Nutmeg, Marigold. None had stuck. The kitten was a curious blend of mischief and gentleness, with a tail that flicked like a wand and eyes as bright as the dawn. She had found it weeks after Clara's passing, waiting at the gate, as if drawn by the very spirit that once lingered there. And though Sarah knew better than to believe in signs, something about that tiny creature felt like a whisper from Clara, or perhaps from her mother beyond the veil of memory. "Maybe you'll tell me your name when you're ready," she said softly, reaching out to scratch beneath the kitten's chin. It purred, a sweet, fragile sound like the rustle of silk. The town of Havenridge embraced the arrival of spring in its usual quiet way. Mr. Henderson reopened his workshop to fix the town's benches. Mrs. Gable put up fresh bunting on the general store and hosted her annual spring tea. The local children rode their bikes in uneven zigzags along Main Street, their laughter rising like birdsong. Sarah had become a familiar face by now. No longer the grieving daughter passing through, she was simply Margaret's girl, a phrase said with warmth and affection. She volunteered at the library once a week, contributed to the church bake sales, and hosted a small monthly writing circle on her porch, where villagers would share poems and memories over cups of chamomile tea. People had taken to asking her about Clara, especially those who still visited the cemetery. "She was always there," old Mr. Jenkins said once, his cane tapping gently on the cobblestones. "Sat by your mother's grave like it was church. Some things you just can't explain." Sarah would smile softly and nod. Some stories didn't need explaining. They simply needed remembering. As the weeks went on, Sarah found herself writing more. She'd always enjoyed journaling, but now the words flowed with purpose. Her latest project, a novel inspired by her mother's life and Clara's loyalty, was taking shape like a tapestry being threaded from love and longing. She called it The Cat Who Slept on the Grave. It wasn't just a book. It was a tribute. Every Sunday, without fail, she still visited her mother's grave. Sometimes the kitten joined her, sometimes not. She would bring fresh wildflowers, sit on the bench, and read aloud a paragraph or two from her drafts. "I think you'd like this part," she'd say, and smile into the breeze. Clara would have too. The cemetery had become less a place of sorrow and more a sanctuary, a sacred patch of earth where memory and presence intertwined. Sarah often saw others there now, drawn by the legend of the black cat and the old woman she never left behind. They would pause at Margaret's grave, whisper a few words, and sometimes leave tiny trinkets, feathers, polished stones, folded paper cranes. Sarah never disturbed them. It was as if Clara's devotion had left behind a kind of magic, a gentle, silent magic that softened grief and offered quiet companionship. One warm evening in early May, Sarah stood on the porch, sipping lemonade and watching the kitten chase a butterfly. The garden was fully awake now, roses blooming in blushing layers, lavender humming with bees, the old apple tree draped in blossoms. Wind chimes sang in the breeze, and the scent of honeysuckle clung to the air. It felt, for the first time in years, like joy didn't have to come with a price. She glanced toward the old tree where Clara was buried, the small carved stone nestled in a bed of violets. "Thank you," she whispered. And she meant it. Not just for the loyalty. Not just for the years of quiet companionship. But for reminding her, through fur and purrs and soft, steady presence, that love never truly disappears. It changes shape, finds new forms, but it never ends. Just then, the kitten leapt into her lap, paws damp with dew. Sarah laughed. Okay, you win." She scratched its ears. "Maybe you're not Clara. But I think you're something new. A new story. A new beginning." The kitten blinked up at her. "Let's try a new name," she mused. "How about Willow?" The kitten purred louder. "Willow it is." Later that night, after Willow had fallen asleep curled in the crook of her arm, Sarah sat by the fire, journal in hand. She wrote. "Grief is not an end. It's a bridge. A long, winding bridge that connects what was with what is and what will be. Some of us walk it alone. Some of us are lucky enough to be led by pawprints." She paused. And then, slowly, she added. "To Clara, who waited. To Margaret, who loved. And to Willow, who came when I needed her most." Outside, the stars blinked through the night sky. The house stood peacefully under the canopy of spring. And in the garden, where the oak tree swayed gently in the breeze, the last of the wildflowers glowed like memories refusing to fade. Time has a curious way of folding in on itself in small towns like Havenridge, where stories pass from porch swings to playgrounds, carried on the winds like pollen. Though the years rolled on and seasons cycled like pages in a well-loved book, one tale refused to fade. The tale of a woman, her cat, and the quiet bond that outlived death. Sarah had now lived in her mother's cottage for 5 years. What had once been a place shadowed by grief was now filled with warmth, color, and laughter. Willow, now fully grown and a little rounder than she should be, spent her days chasing moths in the garden, napping on windowsills, and following Sarah from room to room like a little orange ghost of devotion. Each morning, Sarah would open the windows and greet the dawn, a ritual that had once been her mother's. And every Sunday, as sure as the sunrise, she still walked the pebbled path to the cemetery, a bouquet of wildflowers in hand, Willow sometimes trotting behind. Margaret Preston's grave had become a quiet landmark, not because of the stone itself, but because of the stories people attached to it. Locals still spoke in hushed reverence about Clara, the black cat who had appeared after Margaret's death and had stayed faithfully at her grave for years. Children grew up hearing the tale at bedtime. Elderly folks used it as proof that love never dies. Teenagers whispered it to each other under the moonlight, half challenging their fears by visiting the cemetery after dark. But none knew it as intimately as Sarah. And now, the story was about more than Clara. It had grown, evolving like vines around a trellis, reaching upward. Now it included Willow, the new life that had emerged from sorrow, and the community that had wrapped its arms around Sarah when she returned, lost and unsure. Sarah had become something of a local fixture herself. Her book, The Cat Who Slept on the Grave, had been published 2 years ago. What began as a personal project of healing and memory turned into something that struck a chord far beyond Havenridge. It was picked up by a small publisher, and through word of mouth and a few tear-jerking social media shares, it gained a modest but devoted following. Readers from around the world wrote letters to Sarah, stories of their own lost pets, departed parents, and the strange, beautiful signs they'd seen in moments of quiet heartbreak. Some said they'd cried while reading it, others said it made them call their mothers or adopt a shelter cat. It wasn't fame that came with the book, but something better, connection. A shared understanding of love, loss, and the invisible threads that tie souls together across lifetimes. Sarah had set up a small writing studio in the garden shed, now lovingly renovated with skylights, shelves full of books, and a little bed Willow had claimed as her own. She wrote every day, sometimes fiction, sometimes essays, always with that same purpose, to capture the invisible. To honor what remains, even after what we love is gone. That spring, a small group of schoolchildren came to interview Sarah for a class project. Their teacher, Mrs. Latham, had assigned a unit on local legends and lore, and the tale of Clara was at the top of every student's list. The children arrived with clipboards, shy smiles, and curious eyes. Sarah welcomed them with lemonade and cookies on the porch. Willow, as usual, made her appearance with perfect timing, leaping onto the railing and stretching like royalty receiving her audience. "Is this the new cat?" one boy asked. "She's not new anymore," Sarah smiled, brushing Willow's fur. "She's been with me for years now. Her name's Willow." "Did she really show up the day after Clara passed?" a girl with thick glasses asked, wide-eyed. "She did," Sarah said. "She just appeared at the garden gate. No tag. No microchip. Just those big curious eyes and the calmest little heart you ever saw." One of the children raised her hand. "Do you think your mom sent her to you?" Sarah paused. The wind stirred the chimes on the porch. Willow blinked slowly and leaned against her leg. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But I do know that when I needed someone most, she came. And sometimes that's enough." The children scribbled furiously on their notepads. Before they left, one of them lingered by Margaret's grave, looking down at the stone, and then at Willow sitting beside it. The girl knelt and laid a small daisy on the grass. "For Clara," she whispered. "Thank you for waiting." Over time, the cemetery became more than a place of endings. It became a place of reflection, even joy. Sarah partnered with the town to create a memorial garden just behind the graveyard. It was a modest space, winding paths, benches, native flowers, but people came. To grieve. To remember. To simply sit in silence. Clara's story was engraved on a bronze plaque near a curved wooden bench, in memory of Clara, who waited. And for all the companions who keep our hearts alive. Visitors left notes tucked under stones. Poems. Drawings of black cats and orange ones. A traveling woman from Oregon mailed Sarah a hand-carved figurine of Clara, saying she'd read her book while recovering from surgery and had wept for 3 days. Sarah never tired of hearing the stories. Because she knew now, more than ever, that stories were how we survive. Willow was getting older now. She had a little gray around her muzzle and didn't chase butterflies as much. But she still followed Sarah on her Sunday walks. Still curled beside her as she wrote. Still jumped up onto Margaret's gravestone every spring morning and basked in the sun as if it had risen just for her. One morning, Sarah sat beside the grave with a journal in her lap and Willow pressed against her side. She closed her eyes, letting the breeze carry the scent of lilacs and earth. "You would have loved this," Mom," she whispered. Then she laughed softly. "Maybe you do." She opened the journal and began writing. A woman lived, and a cat waited. And in the waiting, a love was never lost. She wrote until her hand ached and the shadows grew long, and still, Willow didn't move. Years later, children still came to see the grave. Teenagers brought their first loves to whisper secrets to the wind. Writers came to sit near the bench and scribble into notebooks. Even those who didn't know the full story felt it, something sacred, something seen. It wasn't just about a cat or a woman anymore. It was about every goodbye that didn't get spoken, every promise whispered into fur, every paw print on a pillow, every meow in the silence. It was about how love lingers. In gardens. In stories. And in the soft presence of a cat, curled on a grave, as the world quietly keeps turning.